Okay, so today we're going to look at the advantages and disadvantages of the jury system. So for this area of the study design, there's really two key skills that you need to be able to do. Firstly, it's just to be able to evaluate the jury system, so give advantages and disadvantages and come to a conclusion. You also need to be able to analyse its contribution to an effective legal system. So how does a jury contribute to fair and unbiased hearing? How does it contribute to effective access? And how does it contribute to timely resolution? And really, for a jury, really its main benefit is about providing a fair and unbiased hearing. Juries, because they increase costs and they increase delays, really just not very good for effective access, and they're not good for timely resolution either. So the first advantage we look at is that juries are able to provide a cross-section of the people because a trial by jury represents a trial by one's peers. So therefore people are more likely to accept the verdict because they've been judged by people who are essentially the same as them, rather than having a decision imposed by the state. And the jury is able to assess the case according to the standards of the general community, because it's made up of people who have been randomly selected from the community. However, the downside of the jury is that often it's actually not a true cross-section, because there are many people who are disqualified, ineligible, or excused for good reason. So that means that the ability of the jury to to provide a cross-section of the people is reduced. A second key strength of the jury system is that it involves the general community in the legal system. It's part of everybody's civic duty. Your duty as a citizen is to take part in jury service. And what that does is it increases people's knowledge of the legal system, because they're able to go in and see it working. Generally that increases the confidence in the legal system, because they see that people are receiving a fair trial free from bias. However, jury service is a difficult task for most people. Juries often experience difficulty either understanding complicated evidence, in particular if there's forensic evidence, medical evidence, or particularly if the case involves financial data, if it's a civil corporate dispute. Also, jury members might struggle coping with the sheer volume of evidence, in particular if there's a lengthy trial or if there's a number of witnesses to hear, then perhaps jury members might be unable to cope with that volume of evidence, and therefore unable to deliver a fair outcome to the case. Thirdly, juries reflect community values. Again, because of that cross-section of the community, they're able to bring a common sense approach to the courtroom, rather than it becoming just too legalistic. If it was just lawyers and judges alone, then perhaps decisions would be based purely on legalistic terms, rather than being based on community values. Because the jury doesn't need to give a reason for its decision, they're able to follow the law if they believe that the law is correct, or they're actually able to ignore the law if they disagree with it. So they're able to ignore the law if they think that that will bring about a fair outcome to the case. However, because juries don't need to give a reason for their decision, that means that there's no way for the parties to tell what reasoning the jury used in reaching their decision. So it's not possible to know currently with our jury system if the jury followed the law correctly or whether they applied it correctly, and so potentially the jury may have made an incorrect decision and there'd be no way of knowing that. The jury system also safeguards against the misuse of power. They act as a buffer between the parties to a case and the state. So the government or the parliament can really make whatever laws they like, but at the end of the day it's the jury that determines guilt or innocence in a criminal case, or they decide for one of the parties in a civil matter. So in criminal cases the state's responsible for prosecution, but the jury decides guilt or innocence. That means that the state or the government can't persecute its political opponents. They can't just make up laws, arrest somebody and then find them guilty of the offence. They must go through the jury as a safeguard against the misuse of power. That therefore increases confidence in the system, because people know that ultimately whatever laws are passed by the government, you can only be convicted if you're judged by a trial of your peers. However, juries tend to increase costs and delays. They're great for fair and unbiased hearing, ensuring that the government doesn't misuse their power, but there's a massive increase in the cost involved and the delays. Delays tend to be caused by having to explain legal terms to the jury, and also in selecting the jury. It tends to lead to a longer trial. And when juries deliberate as well, that takes an amount of time for them to come up with a decision. It also increases the cost involved because the jury has to be paid for its services, either by the party that selected it in a civil case or by the taxpayer for criminal cases. It also means that the trial is likely longer, which means that you have to pay court fees for longer, you have to pay for lawyers for longer, and the jury has to be paid for longer as well, which all increase the cost involved. That increases the court costs and the legal fees. Some other advantages of the jury system include that it spreads the responsibility rather than just the judge deciding the case alone. It means that 12 people in a criminal case or 6 in a civil case are the ones judging it. Again, that increases confidence. It ensures that the decision is more likely to be right. It ensures that there's less legal jargon involved in the legal system, which means that it's more understandable for common people to understand the processes involved. Juries generally get the decision right is another key advantage of the system. They generally make the right decision. It helps to protect democracy again by preventing the misuse of power. Some disadvantages of the jury system is that they're unfamiliar with legal procedure. That means that the trial generally goes for longer. It means that perhaps they're less likely to get the decision right because they don't understand what's going on in court. They can sometimes be influenced by counsel. If a particular lawyer is very influential, then they can perhaps sway the case, which would reduce the ability to achieve a fair hearing. Juries tend to have a high acquittal rate. They tend to find people not guilty a higher percentage of the time because it's generally easier for people to shift their verdict from guilty to not guilty than the other way. It's also difficult for juries to reach a decision, particularly if there's 12 people in a criminal case who all have to come to a unanimous verdict. That can be quite difficult and it can increase the delays involved. Another disadvantage is that juries tend to be inconsistent with the amount of damages that they award. Because people only do jury service generally once, the amount of damages that they award can be quite inconsistent, and that could be unfair on one of the parties if they have to pay a larger amount of damages than perhaps what they would otherwise. Finally, media influence is a big disadvantage to the jury system. If there's a high-profile case that's been in the media, it's very difficult to get jurors who haven't heard of the case and haven't developed biases before being selected for jury service. And that's it.